This program contains coarse language and images that may disturb some viewers.
Every military contact since forever has had a dark stain somewhere. If you don't treat things like this in an open and honest way before the public, you get a rot that sets in.
For more than 2 decades, some brave men and women have been wrestling with the ghosts of East Timor.
The truth has never come out. Something occurred on that battlefield that day, and I can guarantee you a lot of the guys that are there are still carrying the guilt of what they witnessed.
Had things been done the way that it should have been done, we wouldn't be sitting here today. There wouldn't be questions over what many people see was a really incredibly successful deployment.
2 decades on, those who served speak for the first time about how these events in East Timor still haunt them.
I'm in Timor every single day, and I have been for 22 years. Some days are much better, some days are really shit.
The blood, the fear, the anger, all those emotions, over and over and over again, I can't help but leave an impression.
Tonight on Four Corners, the first of a 2-part investigation into a clandestine and controversial episode in what was an Australian triumph on the world stage, the military intervention in East Timor. For more than 20 years, the truth of what happened in a deadly clash between Australian Special Forces and pro-Indonesia militia has laid buried, and so too has its aftermath, in which allegations of mistreatment, torture and unlawful killing were levelled at the Australians. For the first time, we can reveal what the Australian, New Zealand and British eyewitnesses saw. In September 2000, Australian military police investigator Carl Falauer was assigned a case that would change his life forever.
I was at work one day, and across the road from my building was our Military Police Central Records office, and my major came over from there and she took me down to the back of the building to an area that we called it the Cone of Silence or the Tree of Silence. We only went there with people when we had to discuss things that were really sensitive. And she said to me, look, we've got a problem. There's allegations coming out of Timor. I'm putting together a small task force and you're going to be on the team.
Did you ever have any inkling how big this would become?
I had an inkling that it was serious, but as to what it then led into and how big it actually did become, no, I didn't.
Over the next 3 years, Carl Falauer was part of a team set up to investigate 19 allegations involving Australian soldiers, ranging from unlawful killing to the mistreatment of detainees.
We flew all around Australia. We visited every state except Tasmania, interviewing potential witnesses. We went to New Zealand and interviewed the New Zealand SAS members that were involved in a part of it. We went to the United Kingdom and interviewed members from the British Special Base Squadron. We went to Timor, located witnesses there and interviewed them. All up, I think we recorded over 330 witness statements.
The investigation was sparked by a fatal operation involving the New Zealand and the Australian SAS. The Kiwis were so shocked by what they saw their Australian comrades do, they broke the Special Forces Code of Silence.
They raised concerns with a New Zealand legal officer, a female legal officer, and told her that things weren't quite what they seen on that day because they were concerned that they would get dragged into something that was not right.
The New Zealand legal officer the Kiwi SAS raised their concerns with was Captain Andrina Gill.
The only thing that they were prepared to say to me, and it was in an informal situation, was that they thought they were doing, quote, dodgy activity.
The Australian SAS were doing dodgy activity.
That was it. But when it comes from a credible source, I think that alarm bells were ringing, and it would seem to me that if they said the word dodgy, I don't think they're making it up.
A proud and independent nation with a young population, East Timor is still haunted by its tragic history. And the violent upheaval of 1999 has left deep scars. We've travelled here to investigate what happened more than 20 years ago. Four Corners has spoken to more than 100 people about what happened, and for many, the Interfet intervention was a source of great pride, and the mere mention of these incidents is seen as a slur on this legacy. But for others, the story of East Timor is incomplete without this chapter being told. In August 1999, following the fall of Indonesian President Suharto, the people of East Timor were given the chance to decide their own future in a referendum supervised by the United Nations. Despite an overwhelming vote in favour of independence, pro-Indonesia militia were determined to stop this tiny territory leaving the Indonesian fold.
The United Nations has decided to stay in East Timor, just as more horrifying evidence emerges that it's needed more than ever.
Others tried to run but were shot. This trek into the bush...
The unfolding bloodshed was beamed into the homes of Australians, watching on in horror.
It brings it right back.
It's still a vivid memory for Australian doctor and aid worker John Cooper.
By the time we got there, Dili was ablaze, really. I think the Indonesians had decided they weren't going to leave. They were going to raise any infrastructure. They'd put all this time and money into Timor, and here they were being usurped. So we're going to destroy all the things we've built up for this, our wonderful society. We're going to destroy it.
Just days after the vote, pro-Indonesia militias exacted their revenge, swarming the town of Suai near the border with West Timor. A prominent local priest from Suai, Father Hilario, had been pleading for help to anyone who would listen.
He told me about bodies being chucked into the swamp and that the militia were killing everyone, and he said, "You must come."
Dr. Cooper travelled to Suai, 180 kilometres southwest of the capital, Dili.
It's been confirmed that at least 100 people, and possibly many more, have been massacred by the pro-Jakarta militias. The slaughter happened in the town of Suai in a Catholic church packed with refugees.
We knew that the bad guys were very close by. You could sort of smell it, you know. It was that toxic. And they were killing and burning as they went back towards West Timor.
What happened at the church in Suai would shock the world and help trigger an international intervention.
There's blood everywhere, there's blood on walls, there's blood on bamboo scaffolding. Bullets weren't used to shoot people because they're probably expensive, so they've just literally herded these people up 3 flights of stairs until there's no further to go, and they've either thrown them over or the people have chosen to jump over, which is about a 50 feet fall, and to their death.
As we went back to Suai's church and half-built cathedral...
Among the ashes, he made a tragic discovery.
They'd burnt the church precinct and all the grounds and killed people, and we went through Father Hilario's home, burnt charred remains of, and out of the ashes near the fireplace I picked up a pair of his glasses. And it was no doubt his glasses because it was his house, and I'd seen him with those glasses on, so he was carted off and killed, and that was all that was left in the ashes. And that was pretty confronting and pretty sad. It was indiscriminate. They were killing anyone near them.
Within days of the slaughter, the United Nations authorised an Australian-led multinational force known as Interfet to deploy to East Timor to stop the violence.
Our soldiers had the legal basis to use up until including lethal force. I called it peace enforcement, or a bit of a nickname, hairy-chested peace operations.
For the first time, we were doing something of this nature. We were leading a big peacekeeping force, a multinational force. The commitment was also important for the Defence Force because the Defence Force, the Army, Navy and the Air Force, had not been serving overseas on any major operations since the Vietnam War.
Interfet troops began arriving on the 20th of September 1999.
The job of the Interfet was to go in and establish peace. Their job was not to go in and shoot up everybody they could find. Their job was to dampen down the situation and bring it to a point where the Indonesian soldiers would leave.
The main thing, I think, in retrospect, that no one wanted was an incident because it was a powder keg. Had there been an incident, some Indonesian troops shot or a big group of Australians shot, it could have just exploded into a major war.
The Australian contingent of Interfet included combat troops and a squadron of elite SAS soldiers.
We were on the first 5 Hercules in. Dili itself was a ghost town, a lot of fires, a lot of militia. We could clearly see militia on the fringes of the airstrip, openly taunting us. We took a ride through Dili on the back of this Indonesian military truck, arrived at the UN compound that had been evacuated. I think it couldn't have been more than 10 to 12 hours beforehand, and it was an absolute mess. People's lives just strewn everywhere. It was just devastating. I will never, ever, as long as I live, forget. This was on the second day in country, and we were driving up the hill into the hills at the back of Dili to a place called Dare, where there was a Catholic church. That's where the population of Dili was. And I will never forget the sound of hundreds of thousands of people cheering. It's awesome in its full meaning of that word.
A week into the deployment, Andrina Gill arrived in Dili. A qualified barrister and military lawyer, her job was to make sure that foreign troops followed the rules.
I was on loan to the headquarters Interfet, and in particular the Interfet Combined Legal Office, or ICLO. And so my role there was to be part of the headquarters legal team that gave advice to the commander.
And the commander was Peter Cosgrove?
Yes, that's right. It was incredibly challenging because it was an unknown situation. We were grappling with many issues that we weren't used to or hadn't perhaps come across before.
David Freeman was assigned to work with Andrina Gill at the legal office in Dili.
And I was part of the advance party that went in with General Cosgrove on the 20th of September. His nickname, what we called him in Timor, because I used to go to church with him, we called him St. Peter. And of course now he's known as Sir Peter.
We will stop it. We do not want that.
We'd follow him to the end of the earth.
Get the information.
He was a very straight shooter. He was, I thought, very impressive. Nothing theatrical. He was very to the point, nitty-gritty, down-to-earth sort of stuff. This is the situation. This is what we're doing. Very firm. No mucking around.
For frontline operations, the Australian SAS would join with colleagues from the New Zealand and British Special Forces to form Response Force, the tip of the spear against the pro-Indonesia militias.
Go over here, so you're covering down that way, let's go.
The Response Force did the sorts of things that the SAS train for and are expert at. Surveillance, gathering information, reconnaissance. They were able to move very quickly to carry out raids to secure areas if they needed to be secured.
Michael Clary was a sergeant in the Intelligence Corps attached to the SAS.
We had been with them for approximately, I think, about 2 to 3 weeks in our staging area, and that was at Tyndall. My thoughts? Champions. They're really, really good guys. Very professional. Very proud to have served with them.
On the 6th of October 1999, a group of soldiers from Response Force had set up a roadblock at this intersection southwest of Suai.
The first hostilities for Australian troops came after they moved into the troubled southwest town of Suai, conducting a sweep through the area and establishing a roadblock.
It was here the SAS opened fire for the first time in the operation.
They fired shots after a truck burst through the checkpoint, injuring 4 occupants.
In the aftermath, more than 100 people were rounded up. 14 were sent back to Dili for interrogation. The rest were escorted in a convoy by Australian SAS soldiers towards the border with West Timor. This is the road the convoy took towards the West Timor border. The SAS were in Land Rovers and a Unimog truck, the locals in an assortment of vehicles. And it was right near here, about 4 kilometres west of Suai, that a deadly trap was sprung.
As they go down along the road, suddenly the trucks ahead speed up, and clearly something is happening. And very soon those 2 Land Rovers come under enemy fire, militiamen firing at them in an ambush.
2 Australian SAS soldiers were hit, one in the leg and arm, the other in the neck.
X-rays show just how close Interfet came to losing its first soldier in East Timor.
They were Australia's first serious conflict casualties since the Vietnam War.
It would be a period of high tension. They'd be on a high, but they're also very tightly disciplined and they know what needs to be done. But for these soldiers, this was the first time that they had been in action.
As the 2 SAS soldiers received emergency treatment, Response Force launched a counterattack, pouring fierce fire in the direction of the militia. When the shooting stopped, 2 suspected militia lay dead.
2 Australian soldiers.
The Interfet commander, Peter Cosgrove, addressed the waiting media in Dili.
The militia were armed with an SKS rifle and an FN rifle. These weapons have been recovered along with their webbing, which was military-style webbing, although the men were dressed in the usual militia garb.
After the clash at Suai, the bodies of the 2 militia were flown to Dili.
That was a big day. We had obviously been notified that there had been a contact. I do know that a large force had been contacted by bad guys, militia, at the time.
Back in the capital, Intelligence Corps Sergeant Michael Clary helped search the bodies of the dead militiamen, a confronting task given the state of the corpses.
It was hot, sweaty, smelly, very smelly. We had like folding tables and each person was laid out on a table. For the first 5 minutes, it's just about, holy shit, there's 2 people in front of us. And to say that they had died violently is probably an understatement. They were very badly wounded. You're moving these bodies and a lot of fluid comes out, a lot of blood, there's a lot of grey matter. The other thing that struck me was these are two people, and that's how I have to treat them. I didn't see them as dead bodies, I saw them as people.
Yeah, I can see them as plain as day now, on the tables, the hole in the head, equipment laid out. SS standing over them, take photos.
Alan Joyce was an Australian Defence Force sergeant who was asked to help photograph the militiamen's bodies.
The blood on my hands, a couple of times after I'd finished that, I kept waking up, smelling my hands, thinking, oh, I've got to wash them. But I would scrub them clean, they were clean, but it's just, he said that's just in your mind, that you think they're not clean.
Photographs of the bodies obtained by Four Corners reveal they had horrific wounds. Some who were there believe they may have been shot at close range.
One man was missing a greater portion of the top of his head. If I remember, it was this part of his head was gone, and you clearly see his brain. And we all remarked at the same time that that was done really close. And we knew that, not being experts, but we knew it because the entry wound was burnt. And you know that when you fire a weapon, there's a muzzle blast. Stuff comes out of the end of the barrel and it burns. If it's too close, it will burn the skin. And in this particular fellow's case, he had one of those injuries. The other fellow, from memory, was missing a greater portion of his jaw. And we made the same observation in that there was an entry wound from memory on his forehead that was once again burnt, which indicated to us that whatever had done this had been done probably at very close range.
So, the day after the ambush, Interfet legal officer Andrina Gill wanted an investigation because it was the first fatal shooting of the mission.
I see my role as ensuring that matters are looked at properly and thoroughly, and if there was compliance with the rules of engagement, then the matter's at an end and there's a documentary record, and it protects them because it's all done properly.
In her daily diary entry, she recounted General Cosgrove's response.
Commander Interfet came in and basically announced he will not authorise an investigation. The officer in command or commanding officer can be questioned, and if they believe acted appropriately, the matter is at an end. He does not want action such as the incident last night scrutinised internally in this environment. However, my view is it could bite. It could be seen as a cover-up.
In a statement, Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners, "At the time, I was unaware of any alleged impropriety. Had I been, I would have immediately initiated an investigation." In the days afterward, stories about what really happened at Suai started to spread among members of the New Zealand SAS.
Some of these guys were not happy with what happened at the scene. I believe that what they were telling to us was the truth. They were extremely credible. They were very nice, likeable guys. We had very good conversations with them. It was a serious matter, and some of the stuff that we were bringing up, you could see physically upset them.
Within 12 months, a full-blown military police special inquiry was underway.
The MP investigators, can you remember what they did focus on when they spoke to you, what they were trying to get the bottom of?
My understanding, or my recollection, was in relation to the Suai contact and the deceased militia and whether there'd been unlawful killings as a result of that contact.
The investigation would stir up a world of pain for all involved.
Throughout the whole process, at times we're treated like pariahs, sort of thing. Even amongst our own people, some people were against us, some of them were for us. A lot of professional jealousies on some parts.
The investigators' role was to determine exactly how the two militia were killed. One of the soldiers involved in the ambush was an experienced member of the Australian SAS, a leader out on the patrols highly trained in the art of war, who we will call Operator K. He would become a key focus of the long-running Australian military police investigation over the Suai ambush, with talk of unlawful killing and allegations of the mistreatment of the two bodies. Among the people the investigators spoke to were members of the New Zealand SAS, and Four Corners has obtained their statements. Three Kiwi SAS soldiers described hearing gunshots after the firefight.
I heard a number of shots. Each time I heard one, I went to ground. This happened about 2 or 3 times.
One of his comrades pinpointed where they came from.
These shots came from the Australian side of the road.
The Kiwi soldiers believe the shots were being fired into the militia corpses, which is illegal.
I heard someone call out, "They're our rounds, just shooting the bodies," or words to that effect.
The way we're trained is that when you're in a conflict, when you're fighting through, everything's fair game. But once you stop and you go back into what we call reorg, when you're pulling all the wounded and the dead bodies back in, there should be no reason to shoot anyone.
A New Zealand SAS soldier informed investigators he was told that Operator K had put a few extra rounds into the bodies that were already dead. A soldier who was standing a few metres away later reported it appeared that both bodies had been shot through the throat.
The wounds to the throat concerned me, as it was near impossible to have 2 separate wounds on each body to the throat in similar positions.
Michael Clary later told military police about a conversation he had with an Australian SAS trooper who gave a similar account.
He said to me, "I was involved in the sweep of the contact area. I was located next to Operator K during this sweep, and I saw Operator K shoot both of the bodies at close range."
This SAS trooper would later tell investigators that he was dehydrated after the ambush, his recollection of events was hazy, and he could not recall the conversation with Clary. But for Clary, the stories swirling about Suai could not be ignored.
Those stories at the time, with the little bit of information that I knew, didn't sit well with me at all. As a soldier, as a man, as a dad, as a husband, I just thought, if this is true, then it's complete bullshit. You just don't do that.
Investigators uncovered an even more shocking version of events. A New Zealand SAS soldier recounted a conversation with an Australian colleague.
He then went on to say how Operator K was trying to claim the kills from the ambush site. He further went on to tell me how when the 2 bodies were recovered, one of them was not dead and it got up and started to run away when Operator K arced him up.
Arcing up is slang for shooting. In this case, someone who was allegedly running away, which would constitute murder.
If someone's shooting at you or a fellow soldier, you've got the right to shoot, to kill. But if they're running away and they're not a threat, then you're not allowed to shoot. Same as they might have a rifle, but if they've got their hands up, you can't go, you've got a gun and shoot him.
Something occurred on that battlefield that day, and I can guarantee you a lot of the guys that are there are still carrying the guilt of what they witnessed.
After the ambush, the bodies of the 2 dead militia were loaded on top of this Australian light armoured vehicle, or LAV, and taken into Suai itself. The investigators were given damning eyewitness accounts about what they saw Operator K do to the bodies.
On our return to Suai, I can also recall seeing Operator K standing on top of this LAV towards the rear. I heard Operator K scream, "How dare you shoot my boys," or words to that effect. He was also kicking and punching the bodies as he said this. At this time, I was about 10 to 15 metres away from the LAV, and I thought to myself, fuck, he's lost it. He then kicked one of the bodies off the back of the LAV.
3 other New Zealand SAS soldiers saw at least one of the bodies kicked off the vehicle.
I saw Operator K standing on the rear of this vehicle. I heard him scream, "That's for hurting my lads," or words to that effect. I can also recall him kicking the bodies as he said this. He then kicked one of the bodies off the lav, and I assisted in lifting the other one down. I was shocked by what I just witnessed.
Another New Zealand patrol member saw one of the bodies kicked again once it was on the ground.
I also heard the distinctive voice of Operator K saying, "Gotcha, you fuckers," or words to that effect. I heard Operator K's voice emanating from the direction of where I could see a body lying on the ground. Several minutes later, I looked towards the direction of the body again, only to see approximately 2 persons standing in the vicinity of the body, while another kicked it 1 or 2 times.
A New Zealand SAS officer told investigators he was not surprised by these accounts.
This seemed to fit the personality of Operator K as we had come to know him. I would describe him as a loose cannon and often unprofessional in the way he was conducting himself whilst on operations.
Speaking to military police, none of the Australian SAS would back up the Kiwis' accounts. But investigator Carl Fellauer says some were clearly torn when recounting what happened at Suai.
You can always tell when someone's telling you the truth or when they're not. So when we interviewed a lot of the SAS guys, some of them nearly cried when we were talking to them. You could see it in their eyes that they wanted to say things, but out of loyalty to either their fellow soldiers or whatever, they didn't go through with a lot of stuff.
After the killings of the 2 militiamen, Alan Joyce says he was told by an SAS soldier to remove the bodies.
So we got body bags, had to put them in the body bag with their equipment, and then while it was still darkness, put them back in the Land Rover, take them out of the airport, and told to put them under a tarp and just leave them there because the locals will bury them. And I put them there because I was told to do that. We just dumped them there, no respect for them at all because they wanted to get rid of them.
After the Suai mission, the New Zealand SAS complained that they were left out of the operational debrief.
I remember a number of the Kiwis bringing up saying that they were excluded, and I believe that they were concerned about what was written in that post-operational report, that it may not have truly reflected what happened.
And why do you think they would have been excluded?
I think they were excluded because they may have told the truth or they would have raised concerns or something like that.
One New Zealand Special Forces officer told the military police investigators he believed there was a toxic element within the Australian SAS.
I became concerned with the attitude of the SASR, and there seemed to be a general perception that this was a shooting war like Vietnam and not a peacekeeping mission. I would describe their attitude as being cowboys. As a result of this, I told my soldiers that this was a peacekeeping mission and not a war. This was to ensure that at no time could we, the New Zealand contingent, be tarred with the same brush, that is, cowboys.
That was heard a lot of times to us, or was conveyed to us a lot of times, that this cowboy attitude.
Later, New Zealand Special Forces expressed concerns to Andrina Gill about another possible breach of the rules of engagement by the Australian SAS. This prompted her to ask to look at the patrol reports. When she raised it with her boss, she says General Cosgrove intervened.
When he entered in the room, he interrupted our discussion about it and he told us that we were not to look at any patrol reports or not to examine the incidents which resulted in the rules of engagement being actioned.
In a statement, Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners he recalled the conversation and said, "The officer had a notion that all patrol reports would be scrutinised in the first place by legal officers. Simply well-intentioned as it was, this was unworkable and would have paralysed the whole operation."
It was really a tough time.
Andrina Gill was frustrated that her boss in the legal office was not giving General Cosgrove the advice he needed.
I thought the head of legal, my boss, would talk to General Cosgrove about that, or maybe talk him through perhaps the risks with not doing that. In the office when I was there, General Cosgrove was not challenged by him.
By 2001, the military police had come to the view that the killing of the 2 militiamen could have been murder. The investigators felt they were under growing pressure.
We just copped a lot of grief, that we were tarnishing the Army's reputation or that, well, we didn't do it. We were only there investigating what these guys were telling us.
The Defence Department called in the Australian Federal Police to advise on the case. The AFP noted there were rumours that suggested the killings were an act of revenge for the wounding of the 2 Australian soldiers. The AFP reviewed the evidence and stated that the 2 militiamen may have been shot at short range with a 9mm pistol after they had been wounded. It found the material provides some evidence towards substantiating an allegation of murder. The AFP understood the gravity of the allegations.
The political impact of this investigation has been assessed as substantial and has to be managed.
The AFP advised Defence they could continue on alone, accept AFP help or drop the case. The military police were determined to push on.
Termination of this investigation is not considered to be a sound option. The allegations are known, and if Defence is to avoid counter-allegations of cover-up, all allegations, not just Suai, should be thoroughly investigated prior to any closure.
To sustain a murder charge, the military police needed forensic evidence, so they returned to Timor to exhume the bodies.
I was contacted by a sergeant from the military police who had received my name through the local police forensic services group who knew me and had suggested that they consult me.
Peter Ellis performed autopsies on the exhumed bodies of the suspected militia in October 2002, 3 years after they were killed.
With a time lapse of up to 3 years or more after death, bodies decompose, and they will decompose more rapidly in some conditions, certainly in moist, humid climates, and especially if the bodies have not been, should we say, looked after properly after death. So if they've been buried roughly, not embalmed, and there's been no attempt to preserve them, then they will decompose and deteriorate very rapidly.
The photos from Dr. Ellis's autopsy show some evidence one man may have been shot in the back of the head. He also found both bodies had chest wounds and shattered skulls.
The head injury is suggestive of blunt trauma applied to the front of the forehead. While a gunshot wound cannot be excluded, no obvious exit wound is detected, and the back of the head is not damaged.
The indication was that all the damage had been caused from going inwards. The inference raised whether it was possibly by the shape of it was possibly by the heel of a boot, so that would go along with the allegations of being stomped on. And I do believe that possibly some of the ribs had suffered fractures or damage too, which would indicate that they had been kicked.
And what's your personal belief about that, the stomping theory?
My belief, taken from what I've spoken to people, was that someone has gone to town on the body, has used their foot and caved the head in.
And do we know if that body was alive or dead at the time?
I have no idea. I would, I hate saying the word assume, I believe that the body was dead because I believe that someone put some rounds into him post-battle, which
is illegal.
Yeah.
The autopsy reports show the bodies were so decomposed they were unable to determine if they were shot at close range. But they did find the 2 men died of either gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma. Without eyewitnesses or conclusive forensic evidence, the military police were unable to recommend a murder charge.
I'd put 2 years of hard work into a job. In the military, our job is to investigate an allegation, whether it's true or not. But you put your heart and soul in it. I believe that we had a prima facie case that something occurred.
Based on the military police investigation, Operator K was charged with kicking the corpses. The case hinged on the testimony of the New Zealand SAS.
Our personnel found themselves in the midst of somebody else's shitstorm, and it has an appearance of them trying to walk through it without getting covered in it.
New Zealand journalist David Fisher investigated the Suai saga and its aftermath.
There were 9 New Zealand soldiers who were considered witnesses or persons of interest in an inquiry that was being carried out by the Australian Defence Force. That inquiry was to do with what they called indignities to a corpse. 2 of those were identified as key witnesses who would have been needed to testify in any case that went ahead against the SASR member, and they had also expressed a willingness to take part and to offer their testimony.
The 2 Kiwi SAS soldiers were all set to testify against Operator K, but their superiors in the New Zealand Defence Force had genuine fears for their safety if they did take the stand.
They asked of Australia certain conditions to be put in place to protect their identities. The Australian Defence Force had gone some way down that path. They had said their identities will be protected by name suppression, so their identities aren't going to be something that will be easily accessible to the public. From a New Zealand perspective, though, that wasn't enough. The New Zealand Defence Force had said to Australia, we want more than that. Name suppression isn't enough. We want them to be known by their call signs.
Four Corners has been told the Australian military magistrate hearing the case ruled that the names of the Kiwi witnesses had to be revealed in court out of fairness to Operator K.
So the end result of the debate about name suppression and using call signs was that there was no testimony from the New Zealand soldiers. The case collapsed, and that was the end of it.
The criminal case against Operator K fell apart and he was acquitted. His court records remain suppressed to this day. The Army pursued administrative action against him, but he was again found not guilty.
At the end of the day, there's an investigative process, and the evidence has to be put through to a court of law. That never occurred on this one. So to say that he was acquitted, it really upsets me, it upsets the guys on the team.
After Operator K complained, General Peter Cosgrove, by then Chief of the Defence Force, ordered an inquiry. It found the military police investigation took too long, the investigators were inexperienced, and the quality of witness statements was poor. Operator K received a formal apology. The military police believed it was payback. Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners that he has no knowledge of this sentiment and refutes any sense of payback.
It has caused us a lot of grief. It caused us a lot of sleepless nights. It caused a strain on my marriage. My wife doesn't know anything about what I did in that investigation. The first she'll actually know of the investigation is if she sits down and watches this interview. So for 2 years of my life, I couldn't tell her what I did. And for the 15 years since I got out, I've never spoken to her about it.
Some of those involved in the special inquiry believe the failure to obtain a prosecution had consequences for later operations and was the first link in a chain leading to alleged SAS war crimes in Afghanistan.
If things had been different and that protection had been given to the New Zealanders, I don't think we would have had some of the issues that we had in Afghanistan. I think it gave the wrong message to some people in various organisations that they could do what they want and get away with it.
There were more allegations against the Australian military in East Timor. The New Zealanders were so concerned they began a secret investigation into their Australian comrades. And what it found was even more shocking. Next week on Four Corners, evidence of torture.
It's outrageous. I mean, you can't do that. I use the word outrageous and unlawful.
Sometimes I think I do wish I did nothing. I wish I had said nothing. I wish I had turned my back. But that wasn't really an option. I had no choice and I suffered the consequences.